Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome back Resa Lewis, an emergency physician, and we introduce Jake Horowitz. He's the co-founder of the physician platform Off Call, and they're here to discuss the article, Why Women ER Doctors Earn $21,000 Less Than Men. Resa and Jake, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us, Kevin. Great to be here.
Great
All
to
right.
be here.
All right. So let's jump straight into this article. Jake, I believe this was published on Off Call. The study was there, Why Women ER Doctors Earn $21,000 Less Than Men. For those who didn't get a chance to read that article, tell us what it's about.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the opportunity. So Off Call is a new platform for and by physicians to help bring about pay and workload transparency. And we rely on anonymous and free submissions from any physician all across the US. And what we do at Off Call is we collect that data and we analyze that data over thousands of data points and see where there's interesting trends or disparities across specialties and across different types of metrics. So we did a deep dive on emergency medicine. And honestly, the data that we looked at was really troubling. What we found is that two emergency physicians who have similar training, work at the same hospital, contracted to work the same number of hours, see roughly the same number of patients. So honestly, controlling for all of the confounders that one would want to think about. If one is a man and one is a woman, the woman will earn about $21,000 less each year than the male doctor. And, I think the subheadline, that's the big headline. The subheadline, when you look at a bunch of the other data points, are equally as problematic. If you look at hourly pay, even adjusted for workload, women earn $17 less per hour. If you look at a career progression, we found that this widens over time. So mid-career female physicians earn $28,000 less. And later career female physicians earn $40,000 less. And then even if you look across different pay structures, so productivity models or hourly or salaried models, for productivity-based pay models, men earn roughly $59,000 more than women. So across every metric that you would want to see and across all of the confounders that typically get brought up in terms of explaining this, what we found controlling for all of that is that very unfortunately in emergency medicine, there's a wide pay gap between male and women physicians.
And of course, we're going to talk about some of the potential root causes for that pay gap. But before I do, Jake, so this data is something that's proprietary to Off Call. This isn't publicly available. Like, how is it different for something that you would get like at MGMA, for instance?
Great question. Yeah, so this is a new data set that we created at Off Call. I think for years, there are platforms like MGMA and others that present salary data, but for years, it's been hard to access for physicians, and it's served more on employers, frankly. And that's part of why we wanted to create Off Call, is to give physicians direct access to this data at any time, whenever they want it, whenever they need it. And you can get that at Off Call. And, there are salary surveys and social media groups and others who collect this data. But what we wanted to do is present a way for physicians to find this data with high confidence for free across any specialty. And so that's what anybody who's listening to your show can get at Off Call today. And that's what we're trying to do at Off Call is present the data and aggregate the data and display the data in interesting ways so that people can actually learn what's happening with that kind of transparency.
Resa, you're an emergency physician. When you first read that finding that Jake described, tell us what your initial reactions were.
It's a great question. And what I'll say is not surprised. And a little bit of like, so what? And what I'll say is, I have been a part of Off Call, believed in the mission of Off Call from the beginning. And I was delighted when they ran the specific data on emergency medicine because, as I said, not new news. Like the publications that have demonstrated this salary gap go back 25 more years. JAMA, Doximity, OpMed, etc. I think what is inspiring, what's important, is the shock that Jake and Graham had, not because they didn't believe like the academic, but there's something different when it's behind a paywall, literally or figuratively, and being published in the medical and scientific PubMed literature versus actually out and publicly available. So this is very, very, very powerful data. So as much as I was like, next, we're ready for solutions, and it's important to have more people speaking about those solutions. And so I really am glad to see that the data sort of says the same thing that we have been hearing for decades, but what is different is this is new. This is 2025. And what Off-Call is doing and has the ability to do is actually run this data for more than just emergency medicine. And I think we're just going to see every single specialty is going to demonstrate this, because historically, every single medical specialty in the House of Medicine has this gender salary gap.
Such a great point. And I do want to share with you, Kevin, and your listeners. I mean, you wouldn't believe after we published this study, or maybe Resa would believe, but you wouldn't believe the messages that we got, mostly from male physicians that were skeptical and said, the typical thing that probably Resa and your female physician audience has heard time and time again, which is, oh, well, that's not in my hospital. Or, oh, you couldn't have looked at the hours or controlled for the hours correctly. That's just not true. Or when you look at hourly pay, that just doesn't add up. I've never seen that. I've never talked to a female physician who has experienced that. And I do think that is the point. Resa mentioned it. There's been studies that have been shared before. And in a certain sense, reporting on this is not new. But in another sense, those comments, I think, reflect what is still deep-seated and undercurrent of this conversation, which is people sort of have a reaction, male physicians anyway, of not in my hospital, or not me, or I can't believe that would be true because I've never heard it. And that's why we feel so passionate that bringing it out in the open and having these kind of conversations on your show, and we're grateful that you're doing this and bringing visibility to it, but having these kind of conversations will help expose people to what's really happening on the front lines.
Resa, when Jake said that some of the feedback from male physicians said that this doesn't happen in my hospital, anecdotally, even before the study, I think that you implied that you have seen that pay disparity personally, or you've heard from your colleagues that there is a gender-based pay disparity that you've seen even before the study came out. Is that correct?
That is more than correct. And I have personal stories, but forget about my personal direct witness. I've been indirect witness, like things explained away. I'll even use the word gaslighting. Oh, well, it's because they want to be at home with family, taking care of young children, taking care of elderly parents. Oh, it's because they take family leave. Like, it's sort of blaming the victim and explained away, which is the beauty of the data. Confounding variables were removed, and they still came up with this. I also think it's powerful that Graham and Jake are the ones putting this out, because people are like, oh, wow, okay, like, what's in it for them? Now, what's in it for them is they believe in pay transparency, and that's that on which they built the platform. But I think I've been hearing this behind closed doors for years, and I think that's another difference. Some of these surveys ask employers, what are you doing for salary transparency? Whereas this has been flipped. The script is flipped. And these are people self-reporting. And it doesn't mean that's not met with sometimes some fear, like what if there's going to be retaliation? What if somehow I get outed? But this is sort of truth. And this has been a persistent trend, and they're just sort of redoing it again. But the audience is different, the timing is different, and perhaps the people amplifying the message is a little different. Of course, I'm glad the guys are talking to the guys, because we actually need everybody at the table. We particularly need the people in power. And in 2025, often the people in power are exactly the same people in power who were in power 20, 50, 100 years ago. So they need to be speaking with themselves, and there needs to be pushback from people that have some of that power to be like, nope, this is data, this is real, and this is not fair.
Jake, as you look at this data from the study any potential causes that jumped out and any potential hidden causes that may not apparently be obvious? What were some of the explanations that may explain that disparity?
I think dive deeper into this topic, what I've realized is the problem is completely multifaceted. And it starts really, really early in physicians' careers. So it starts from residency and it starts from training. And you can look at the top line salary numbers, but you can also look at the subtle things that happen on a daily and a weekly and a monthly basis from feedback and how feedback is delivered from male supervisors to female residents and how that feedback differs if that person is a man versus a woman. And then you can look at reviews and how performance-based reviews based on that feedback differ if the person receiving the feedback is a male versus a female. And even in those kinds of settings and in those small, subtle ways where the feedback and what a female doctor gets told versus what a male doctor gets told in those feedback sessions, you start to see examples of bias creep in. And that compounds. So you start early, and then over the course of your first contract, most physicians do not know that you can negotiate your first contract. And actually, it's advised and a good idea to do so, but that fear particularly comes in for female physicians versus male physicians. And so even more so, many female physicians will just accept the first contract that they're given. Those contracts then end up compounding over the course of a career. So over a 20-year career or a 30-year career or a 40-year career beyond, when you have your first contract and then you're doing productivity metrics and you're doing bonuses and you're doing all these things that compound, you start to see the same pattern creep up over and over and over again. So I wish, Kevin, there was a one-size-fits-all answer to this, and a hospital executive could just look at a paper and say, okay, great, we're going to make the same salary. But unfortunately, it's pretty deep-seated and cultural from what I've seen, and requires a very nuanced understanding of these different aspects of where this starts to creep in and happen over the course of a career.
I'm going to highlight and just jump in and say it really, if you look at starting salaries from the beginning, that's sort of a starting point, if that's the start line, so to speak. And the growth over time, you're already at this gap. And the data from off-call basically highlights that over a lifetime, this could be $600,000. Other studies have shown $1 million difference. And so this is real. And it's also about contributions to retirement. Another piece that plays a role is side gigs. Is your buddy giving you a side gig like, hey, give this sponsored talk? Hey, review this case for medical legal purposes and make sure you charge your hourly. It's also about sort of on the golf course, in the locker room, at the bar, basically some of the social activities where you get offered opportunities because you're in the room. And so it's kind of like I said, literally and figuratively about the paywall, it's literally and figuratively being invited into the room.
So, Resa, in terms of next steps, so I'm going to ask you a two-part question. So, the first scenario, of course, would be that initial contract because that disparity in the initial contract compounds over time. So, talk about what new physicians or new female physicians can do when they have that first job.
Yeah.
And then the second part is, I guess I'm going to say in quotes, corrective action. If a hospital system sees a disparity, what would a practical corrective action plan even look like, right? So, Resa, why did you address those 2 points?
Sure. So number one, salary transparency, salary transparency, salary transparency. Like it seems like such a simple solution / ask, but there's so much protection that goes on within institutions. I worked at one institution that said, oh, we fixed this years ago. There's no need to look at it again. But there was a need to look at it again. And so I think if we can somehow hold institutions, hospitals, private organizations accountable for that transparency, because I do think teaching people to negotiate, never bad, really good tactic. And also, when you say to women, like, you need to ask, you need to negotiate, you need to learn, sometimes it's a little bit of blaming the victim and, kind of fixing the woman rather than fixing the problem. And so I think you can have both and growth mindset, learn how to negotiate, but also like create a system that works and is fair for everybody if you didn't get that extra coaching or that inside scoop. So another point that we bring up in what we wrote is about the power of organizations. You know, medical organizations can be powerful. They can put out statements. They can hold these organizations accountable in a way that we as individuals can't. Because to be clear, we may have individual agency, but these institutions are bigger and more powerful than we are. Lastly, I just think that, you know, part of what we thought would change over time really hasn't. So I think we have to be creative about new ways to fix this challenge. And, you know, I am a devotee of off-call. I believe in what they're doing because they already, just with what they published on emergency medicine and more recently on neurology, they have gotten more eyes, ears, and responses than I think has really happened in traditional scientific and medical publications, sure, because of social media, but also because people are like, wow, I didn't see a change. Wow, I've never seen this data. And for those of us that have been watching these data trends over time, we're shocked that people haven't seen the data, but it just means it hasn't really gotten in front of the people that have potentially a space and a place to make the change.
And Risa, if a female physician discovers that there is a pay disparity between her and her male colleagues, what are some potential options they have?
Yeah, great question. And this happens too commonly, too commonly. Quick story. I know of two people that were hired to split a leadership position. First new job out of completing training. They were hired, one woman, one man. And she, by accident, received his contract and realized that he was starting $10,000 higher than she was too. So, to your question, I think, you know, when these things happen, there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of scarcity mindset in healthcare. That vertical hierarchy is real, and I think the fear is real. People think they're going to get in trouble. So I think, number one, speak to your personal board of directors. These are your go-to people that you trust that can help give you advice in your professional journey. Speak with them. Number two, figure out where it's safe to report these things. Sometimes it's your supervisor. Sometimes it's HR. Sometimes it's an outside organization that puts forth employment rights and, you know, even working with an employment attorney. Sometimes some people choose to go ahead and publish like an op-ed in a major newspaper or something like that. There's no one way, but I think silence is not going to change or move the needle at all. So I think figuring out outlets, but starting with people you trust, run it by them, look at the organization, see, is this a pattern, which likely it is, it's probably not a one-off, and figure out sort of, is there room to make change?
We're talking to Jake Horowitz and Resa Lewis. Jake is the co-founder of the physician platform Off Call, and Resa is an emergency physician. And they're talking about the Kevin MD article, Why Women ER Doctors Earn $21,000 Less Than Men. Now I'm going to ask each of you just to share some take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience. Jake, why don't we start with you?
As a non-physician, when I saw this data, I was outraged. When any person goes in to see a doctor, I recently had the experience of going in to the pediatric emergency room for my child. When any person goes to see a doctor for themselves or for their children, what they want is the best doctor possible to provide the best care. And they want a doctor who's really focused and really passionate and really excited about their job. What they don't want is a physician who's feeling burnt out, who's feeling disgruntled, who's feeling like they're not paid fairly or treated well relative to their colleagues, and therefore cannot possibly provide the best care. So if I have one message, is this data doesn't just impact physicians, it impacts everybody. Everybody should want to see their doctor paid well, and everybody should want to see their doctor paid fairly. And we as a society should want to see women physicians get paid equally to men and get paid well and fairly for what they do.
And Resa, we'll end with you. Your take-home messages.
Double down on everything that Jake just shared. And I want to make a specific comment regarding intersectionality, because this data didn't break down the data by race or ethno-racial background. But when you run those numbers, historically articles, the salary disparities are even worse. So I actually think, safe, equitable, respectful work environments should at minimum demand pay equity, because as Jake said, that pay equity leads to better, safer patient care. And there's nobody that doesn't want the best medical care when they go and meet with a physician. So it just makes sense, and it's good for everybody. Everybody wins.
Resa and Jake, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you, Kevin.